The tank that should have stayed dead. At 3:17 in the morning, on July 13, 1943, somewhere south of Prokhorovka, a Soviet recovery crew moved across a field that should have belonged only to the dead. The battle had ended hours earlier, if a battle ever truly ended on that part of the Eastern Front. The guns had fallen into an uneasy silence, but the ground still breathed heat. Smoke hung low over the steppe. Burned grass gave off a bitter smell. In the distance, a German flare rose slowly, pale and cold, then drifted down over the broken silhouettes of tanks. A T-34 sat near a shallow fold in the ground, its left track torn apart, its rear deck blackened by fire. German observers had seen it stop in the afternoon. They had watched smoke spill from the engine compartment. One hatch had opened. A figure had climbed out, stumbled, then disappeared behind the hull. To the men behind the German anti-tank gun, the matter was finished. One more Soviet tank destroyed. A note was made. A number was added. Somewhere behind the line, in a command post lit by candles and shaded lamps, that number began its journey upward. But now, in the dark, the tank was no longer just a number. Two Soviet mechanics crawled beneath it with frozen fingers and a cable dragged through the mud. A driver sat half inside the hull, listening to the engine as if it were a wounded animal. Another man worked by touch, feeling for torn metal, broken pins, loose links, anything that could be moved, tightened, forced, or stolen from the dead machine beside it. No one spoke much. Words traveled too far at night. The German report had already decided what this tank was. The men in the mud had not. One of them pressed his shoulder against the cold armor and listened. Somewhere inside, fuel dripped. Somewhere farther away, an artillery shell landed with a flat, heavy crack. Dirt scattered over their backs. The driver did not climb out. The mechanic did not let go of the cable. They were not trying to make the machine new. They were not trying to erase the hit or the fire or the panic that had filled the turret when the shell struck. They needed only one thing: movement. If the T-34 could be pulled behind the Soviet line, it might be repaired. If it could not be repaired, it might still give up its road wheels, track links, fuel pump, gun parts, armor plates, or radio components. Even a dead tank could feed the living ones. This was one of the quietest misunderstandings of the Eastern Front. German crews often believed the battle ended when the enemy vehicle stopped. Smoke meant a kill. A broken track meant a kill. An open hatch meant a kill. A tank abandoned on the field meant a kill. And in that moment, from that gun sight, through that smoke, it made sense. A German anti-tank crew did not have the luxury of waiting until morning. They saw a Soviet machine advancing. They fired. It stopped. They looked for signs of movement. They saw none. Another target appeared. Another shell had to be loaded. Another life depended on speed. The front line did not pause for careful accounting. But the battlefield did not end where the gun crew's vision ended. It continued after dark. Continued under cables. It continued in repair yards, behind tree lines, beside railway sidings, inside barns with torn roofs, and in workshops where men worked until their hands split open from cold and oil. The German army was good at counting what it believed it had destroyed. The Soviet army became brutally good at recovering what had not been destroyed enough. That difference mattered. A tank could be knocked out and still come back, could burn and still be stripped, could lose a track and still block a road the next day. It could be counted as dead by one army and treated as unfinished work by another. On the Eastern Front, between those two meanings, entire reports began to drift away from reality. By sunrise, the German position would look across the same field and see fewer wrecks than expected. Some had been dragged away. Some had shifted. Some were hidden behind smoke and folds in the earth. Some were gone entirely. And somewhere in the German records, the destroyed tank remained destroyed. The paper had not moved. The machine had. But to understand why that mattered, we have to follow the number backward, from the battlefield, through the report, into the mind of the army that believed it knew exactly what it had killed. The confidence of the kill report. A battlefield report is written in the language of certainty. Destroyed, disabled, burned, captured. Enemy losses estimated. Friendly losses confirmed. The words are clean because they have to be. Armies cannot operate on hesitation alone. A commander must know whether the enemy attack has been stopped, whether his own flank is safe, whether another assault is likely before dawn. He needs numbers. He needs categories. He needs the chaos outside to become lines on paper. On the Eastern Front, German units produced those lines constantly. A tank crew fired at a Soviet vehicle and saw it stop. An anti-tank gun crew saw flames through dust. A forward observer reported smoke from a hull. A platoon commander gathered claims from men whose ears were ringing and whose faces were blackened by powder. Those claims moved upward, from company to battalion, from battalion to regiment, from regiment to division. By the time they reached headquarters, they no longer smelled of burned oil. They looked precise. This was not always dishonesty. That matters. Many German soldiers believed what they reported. In the violence of an armored fight, a tank that stopped after being hit did look destroyed. A T-34 sitting motionless in the open, smoke rising from its engine deck, hatch open, crew gone. No gunner under fire would pause to imagine a repair team coming for it 6 hours later. He would report the kill, and the report would accept it. The German army had inherited a tradition of staff work that valued accuracy, order, and operational clarity. Maps were marked carefully. Enemy losses were estimated, compared, and forwarded. Commanders made decisions from those figures because no better tool existed. If reports showed Soviet armor being smashed in large numbers, then German officers could believe the enemy's striking power was being reduced. That belief had a logic behind it. Tanks were expensive machines. They needed steel, engines, transmissions, optics, guns, crews, fuel, spare parts, and transport. Destroy enough of them, and an offensive should lose its weight. Destroy enough in one sector, and the next attack should arrive weaker. Destroy enough across a campaign, and the enemy should begin to run out of armored strength. On paper, this was reasonable. But the Eastern Front punished reasonable assumptions. It stretched over distances that exhausted men and machines alike. It swallowed vehicles in mud. It froze engines solid. It covered fields with smoke so dense that a burning tank could be counted by 3 different guns. It left wrecks in no man's land that changed hands after dark. It allowed a machine to look finished in the afternoon and return, patched and ugly, days later. The German report wanted the battlefield to be final. The battlefield was temporary. That was the first crack. A German unit might report 10 Soviet tanks destroyed in a day. Some were truly gone. Burned out, ammunition detonated, armor torn open, crew killed, machine beyond recovery. Others were immobilized, damaged, abandoned, or simply hidden by the conditions of battle. Some may have been counted more than once. Some may have been hit, left smoking, and later recovered. Some may have been written off by the Germans while still valuable to Soviet repair troops. What mattered was not only whether the number was inflated. What mattered was what the number caused commanders to believe. A division that believed it had crushed an armored attack might expect a pause. A corps commander might assume Soviet reserves were thinning. An intelligence officer might look at repeated kill claims and conclude that Soviet armored formations were being worn down faster than they could be restored. Yet the next morning or the next week, Soviet tanks appeared again. Not always the same tanks. Not always in the same condition. Sometimes newly built machines from factories far to the east. Sometimes repaired vehicles pulled from battlefield workshops. Sometimes cannibalized tanks assembled from the remains of others. Sometimes damaged machines good enough for one more assault. Good enough was often enough. That was something German reports struggled to measure. A perfect tank and a barely running tank did not have the same value in a technical manual. But on the front line, a barely running tank could still force a gun crew to reveal its position, could still carry infantry across exposed ground, could still draw fire, could still block a road. It could still make a German commander believe the Soviet attack was larger than expected. War did not ask whether the machine was factory perfect. It asked whether it could move. The German reporting system could record destruction, could record captured vehicles, could count battlefield claims, But it had a harder time measuring Soviet persistence. The way damaged armor passed into repair channels, the way wrecks became spare parts, the way a tank counted as a loss in one moment could still influence combat later. There was also pressure inside the reporting itself. Men under fire wanted their effort to matter. A gun crew that held its position against Soviet armor wanted its success recognized. A commander defending a sector wanted to show that his unit had inflicted heavy losses. In a war where survival often depended on proof of effectiveness, high enemy loss figures carried weight. Again, this did not require invention. Combat created enough confusion on its own. A column of Soviet tanks advances. Artillery lands. Dust rises. A gun fires. A tank stops. Another gun fires at the same target. A third crew sees flames and reports the same burning shape. Later, the field is swept by more fire. By evening, no one can walk forward and check every hull. The report must still be written. So the number hardens. But the steel on the field remains uncertain. This is where the story begins to turn. Because the Germans were not simply misreading Soviet tanks. They were misreading the space between tactical success and operational effect. They could hit a tank. They could stop a tank. They could even destroy many tanks. But they could not always know what those hits meant after the shooting stopped. And behind the Soviet line, men who did not appear in German reports were already working inside that uncertainty. What destroyed really meant. The word destroyed seems simple until it is placed on a battlefield. A tank burning from turret to track, ammunition cooking off, armor split open, destroyed. A tank hit in the engine, abandoned by its crew still holding usable parts, destroyed perhaps to the gunner who fired the shot. A tank with a broken track, stuck in mud, its main gun intact and its engine still capable of coughing back to life. Destroyed, in a report written before anyone reached it. A tank knocked out in the morning, towed away in darkness, repaired in a field workshop, and returned later with mismatched wheels and black scars along its hull. Destroyed, but only for a while. That was the problem. The battlefield used one word for many different realities. In armored war, a tank could stop for a dozen reasons. A track could break. A road wheel could be shattered. The driver could be killed. The turret ring could jam. The engine could overheat. The fuel line could be punctured. A shell could penetrate and kill part of the crew while leaving the machine recoverable. A mine could immobilize the vehicle without destroying its gun. A near miss could damage suspension badly enough to force abandonment under fire. From a distance, many of these looked the same. A stopped tank. A silent gun. Smoke. An open hatch. Men running. To a German observer, that was often enough. And in the immediate tactical sense, he was not entirely wrong. A stopped tank could no longer attack him in that moment. It had been removed from the fight. If the Soviet assault depended on that machine, the German gun crew had done its work. But the Eastern Front did not measure war only in moments. It measured war in days, weeks, and grinding returns. For Soviet repair units, a stopped tank was a question. Could it be reached? Could it be towed? Could the engine be saved? Were the tracks reparable? Was the gun still usable? Had the ammunition exploded? Was the hull burned out or merely scorched? Could parts from another wreck make this one move? If not, could this wreck keep something else alive? The Germans often saw wreckage as evidence of destruction. The Soviets often saw wreckage as inventory. That difference was not romantic. It was practical, sometimes ruthless. A destroyed tank might still contain parts badly needed by another vehicle. Road wheels, track links, periscopes, hatches, machine guns, sections of armor plate, electrical fittings. Anything that could be removed under field conditions had value. A tank too damaged to fight again might still shorten the repair time of another. A battlefield full of wrecks could become, for Soviet mechanics, a parts yard under artillery threat. There was nothing clean about it. Men worked beside machines where crews had died. They crawled through mud mixed with fuel, soot, and sometimes blood. They pulled metal from hulls still warm from fire. They cut, hammered, dragged, and cursed under their breath. They made decisions no manual could fully prepare them for. This engine can be saved. That turret is gone. Take the links. Leave the hull. Move before daylight. It was not genius in the theatrical sense. It was endurance applied to metal. And endurance was something German reports struggled to count. A tank that disappeared into Soviet repair channels might not return immediately. It might take days. It might be cannibalized. It might never fight again as a complete vehicle. But if its components helped 3 other tanks remain operational, the meaning of its loss changed. The German claim still existed. The tactical kill might have been real. But the operational effect was less final than the word destroyed suggested. There was another layer. Who controlled the ground mattered enormously. If German forces held the battlefield after an engagement, Soviet tanks left behind were more likely to be truly lost. They could be inspected, demolished, captured, or stripped by German recovery teams. But if Soviet forces held the ground or could reach the wrecks at night, the category changed. A tank that was a confirmed German kill at 5 p.m. might become a Soviet repair project by midnight. The same machine could move between meanings depending on the front line. This made loss accounting incredibly difficult. German reports could count what German soldiers believed they had knocked out. Soviet records might classify losses differently. Temporarily disabled, under repair, written off, evacuated, or irrecoverable. Post-war historians comparing these records often faced the same problem the soldiers faced. The numbers do not always describe the same reality. A German destroyed tank and a Soviet, temporarily disabled, tank might be the same vehicle. That matters because war plans are built from categories. If headquarters believes enemy armor has been permanently reduced, it may expect the next Soviet attack to be weaker. If the enemy's repair system restores enough vehicles, that expectation becomes dangerous. A commander does not need to be foolish to be misled. He only needs to trust a word that means less than he thinks. Destroyed. It sounds final. On the Eastern Front, it often required another question. Destroyed for whom? Destroyed for how long? Destroyed beyond use or only beyond movement? Destroyed as a tank or useful as parts? The German army was not alone in facing this problem. Every army in the war struggled with claims, losses, and battlefield uncertainty. Air forces overclaimed aircraft. Naval forces misidentified sinking ships. Artillery reports exaggerated damage no one could inspect. War constantly tempted men to turn glimpses into facts. But on the Eastern Front, the scale made the problem enormous. Thousands of tanks. Vast distances. Terrible weather. Fluid front lines. Night recovery. Rapid Soviet production. Relentless pressure. A number that was wrong by a small margin in one engagement could become deeply misleading across months of fighting. And the men most capable of exposing the error were rarely the men writing the reports. They were behind the line, beneath the armor, trying to make one more damaged machine move. The men beneath the armor. They were not the men photographed first. The camera preferred the tank commander standing in an open hatch, goggles pushed up, face dark with smoke. It preferred the infantry riding on the hull, rifles angled outward, eyes fixed on the tree line ahead. It preferred the dramatic wreck, the burning turret, the gun barrel pointing uselessly into the sky. It did not often linger on the man lying under the tank with oil dripping onto his coat. But without him, the tank war on the Eastern Front would have looked different. Soviet mechanics worked in places that did not resemble workshops. A shed with one wall missing. A stand of birch trees behind a village. A rail siding under camouflage netting. A shallow pit scraped into frozen ground. A barn where the roof had been torn open by shellfire and snow fell through the beams onto engine blocks. They worked with what they had. Sometimes that meant proper tools and replacement parts. Sometimes it meant a hammer, a torch, a length of chain, parts stripped from a wreck, and the stubborn belief that metal could be persuaded if there was no other choice. They repaired suspension damage, replaced track links, patched fuel lines, cleaned guns, changed engines when possible, welded armor, pulled vehicles from mud, and decided which machines were worth saving. The decision itself carried weight. A tank might look reparable but take too long. Another might look hopeless but contain exactly the part needed elsewhere. Commander might want every vehicle returned. A mechanic knew some were already gone. In the pressure of battle, judgment became a kind of triage. There was no romance in it. Their hands were cut. Their eyes burned from smoke and welding light. Their ears rang from artillery. They slept poorly, if at all. In winter, tools froze to skin. In spring, mud swallowed boots and jacks. In summer, dust settled into grease until every surface felt like grit. A man could spend hours under a hull listening not only to the machine, but to the front line shifting closer. The German report did not include him. It included the tank. Destroyed. But the mechanic saw something else. He saw a track that could be rebuilt. A wheel that could be replaced. A transmission that might hold for another 10 kilometers. A gun still aligned well enough to fire. A hull that did not need beauty, only function. A German engineer might have looked at the same vehicle and seen poor workmanship, rough welds, crude finish, simple fittings. Many German assessments of Soviet tanks recognized their strengths but also judged them through the lens of German engineering expectations. The T-34 could be uncomfortable, mechanically strained, difficult to see from, hard on its crew. It was not magic. It broke. It burned. It failed. But it was also designed for a war in which perfection was less important than mass, repairability, and return. A machine that could be repaired under bad conditions had value beyond its armor thickness or gun caliber. A machine that could accept rough field work and still move had a kind of battlefield honesty. It did not have to impress a factory inspector in peacetime. It had to cross a field under fire. The men beneath the armor understood that better than anyone. They also understood something headquarters could forget. A tank was not only a weapon. It was a shelter, a transport, a signal, a moving wall. Even damaged, it could change the behavior of men around it. Infantry would move differently if a tank rolled beside them. German gunners would reveal themselves if one appeared at the wrong moment. A single repaired vehicle could force a pause, draw fire, block a narrow road, or carry ammunition forward. Could buy time. Sometimes, in war, time was the only victory available. The Soviet repair system depended on many levels. Crews making quick fixes near the front, mobile workshops handling larger repairs, depots farther back sorting what could be restored, factories producing new vehicles and parts. But at the front edge of that system stood exhausted men making immediate decisions in mud and smoke. They knew the tank did not have to be perfect. They knew the next attack might come before the repair was finished. They knew that if they failed, a crew might go forward short one vehicle, one gun, one layer of steel between them and the open field. There is a particular kind of courage in work no one cheers. The mechanic does not charge. He does not raise a flag. He does not usually appear in the clean sentence of a battle summary. He tightens a bolt while shells land somewhere beyond the trees. He lies still when flares rise. He waits for the sound of aircraft to pass. Then he reaches again for the wrench. What the Germans believed was that Soviet tank losses could be counted by what had been stopped. What they often did not see was the labor that began after stopping. And because they did not see it, they underestimated it. But even honest labor could not explain everything. The battlefield itself helped create the illusion. Smoke, fear, dust, and distance turned men's eyes into unreliable instruments. The next misunderstanding began not in the workshop, but at the moment of the kill. The German eye and the battlefield illusion. A gun sight does not show truth. It shows a narrow circle of the world. Inside that circle, a German anti-tank gunner might see a Soviet tank emerge through smoke, its hull rocking over uneven ground, its tracks throwing dirt behind it. He might hear the commander shout the range. He might feel the breech slam shut, the recoil of the gun, the pressure in his chest as the shell leaves. Then impact. A flash against armor. The tank slows. Smoke rises. Someone yells that it is burning. The gun crew reloads because another tank is coming. That is how a battlefield becomes a claim. No one in that moment has the full picture. The gunner cannot walk forward and inspect the damage. The commander cannot ask the Soviet crew whether the engine is dead or merely stalled. The observer cannot always tell whether the flames come from fuel, ammunition, spilled oil, or grass burning beneath the hull. The report must be made from fragments. and fragments are dangerous when they become facts. On the Eastern Front, visibility was often miserable. Dust from tank columns could hang over a field like dirty fog. Artillery strikes tore soil into the air. Smoke from burning vehicles drifted across firing lanes. Snow flattened distance and made shapes uncertain. Rain turned roads into black ribbons and fields into reflective mud. At dawn and dusk, shadows did half the work of camouflage. Under those conditions, the eye wanted certainty. A tank hit and smoking looked destroyed. A tank stopped beside another burning vehicle might be counted with it. A crew bailing out looked like proof that the machine was finished. Several German weapons firing at the same target could each believe they had delivered the fatal hit. This was not unique to the Germans. Overclaiming is as old as combat reports. Fighter pilots overclaimed enemy aircraft. Submarine crews misjudged ships sinking in darkness. Artillery observers reported damage they could not confirm. War rewards quick judgment and then asks paperwork to pretend that judgment was measured carefully. But tank warfare on the Eastern Front made the problem particularly harsh. The engagements were large. The movement was fast. The stakes were immediate. A gun crew that waited too long might be crushed. A commander who hesitated might lose his entire position. No one was rewarded for saying, "We may have disabled several tanks, but their final status remains uncertain." So the language hardened. Destroyed. Knocked out. Burning. Enemy attack repulsed. A German officer receiving these reports might not be foolish to believe them. He trusted trained soldiers. He trusted the chain of command. He trusted the visible evidence. Soviet tanks had been stopped in front of German guns. But what he lacked was continuity. He did not always know what happened to those tanks after his men shifted fire, after smoke covered the field, after darkness fell, after the front line changed by a few hundred meters. This is where battlefield vision became battlefield illusion. A tank could be hit hard enough to stop, but not hard enough to die. A shell could damage external fittings without penetrating the crew compartment. A broken track could immobilize a tank in the open, making it useless for the attack but valuable if recovered. A fire could look catastrophic from a distance and still leave salvageable parts. Even a burned-out hull might become a source of components. German reports saw an ending. Soviet repair teams saw a beginning. There was also the problem of repetition. The same wreck could appear in multiple reports if units overlapped sectors or if a battlefield remained under observation for days. A tank hit by one gun might later be fired on again by another. A wreck burning at dusk might be counted by a unit that had not seen the original hit. In large battles where dozens or hundreds of vehicles were moving, stopping, burning, and shifting across the ground, the possibility of double counting was not small. The report was trying to freeze a moving reality. But the reality kept moving. The human mind also played its part. Under fire, men remember danger differently. The tank that almost reached the gun position becomes larger in memory. The number of targets feels greater. The smoke feels thicker. The survival of the crew depends on believing they acted effectively. When the report is written, fear and relief are still present, even if no one writes those words down. A man who has just survived a Soviet tank attack does not calmly audit every claim. He breathes. He checks his crew. He looks for the next threat. He reports what he believes he saw. That belief travels upward. At headquarters, it becomes data. The danger was not only that German units sometimes overclaimed. The deeper danger was that those claims could confirm what German commanders wanted or needed to believe. That Soviet armor, however numerous, was being consumed at unsustainable rates. And sometimes it was being consumed terribly. Soviet losses were real. Crews died in burning tanks. Entire attacks were shattered. Fields were left crowded with wrecks. The Red Army paid in metal and lives at a scale that can still feel difficult to absorb. But German reports could be true in the moment and misleading in the campaign. That is the important distinction. A gunner could honestly stop a tank. A unit could honestly repulse an attack. A battlefield could honestly be filled with Soviet wreckage. And still, the larger conclusion that Soviet armored strength had been permanently broken could be wrong. Because after the smoke thinned, another army went to work in the dark. And that army did not need to win the argument on paper. It needed only to drag the steel away before morning. The night cruise. Night changed the battlefield. In daylight, it belonged to guns, aircraft, observation posts, and men with binoculars pressed hard against their faces. Every movement drew fire. Every disabled tank in the open became a target again and again, struck until it burned or until darkness hit it. But after sunset, the field changed hands in a different way. Not completely, never safely, but enough. A Soviet recovery crew might wait behind a low ridge until the last light faded. They would listen first. Not for one sound, but for layers of sound: German engines, distant shouting, artillery adjustment, machine gun bursts, the metallic clatter of their own equipment. A man can learn to tell whether a battlefield is asleep or merely pretending. Then they moved. No headlights. No unnecessary voices. Cables coiled over shoulders. Tools wrapped to keep them from clanking. A tractor or another tank waiting behind cover. Engine low, ready to pull. Sometimes the disabled vehicle was only a few hundred meters away. Sometimes that distance felt like an entire country. The men knew what waited out there. Mines, trip flares, German patrols, snipers, mortars that could begin without warning, wrecks still hot from fire, bodies, broken ammunition that might detonate if mishandled. Mud deep enough to trap the recovery vehicle too. Snow that made every silhouette visible under a flare. Still they went, because a tank left on the field could become a permanent loss by morning. German guns might finish it. Engineers might demolish it. The front might shift. The ground might become unreachable. What was reparable tonight could be gone tomorrow. So the night crew worked with urgency, but not haste. Haste made noise. Haste snapped cables. Haste got men killed. Imagine one such crew reaching a T-34 lying at an angle in a shell crater. The left track is gone. The hull is scarred. One hatch is bent open. The smell is difficult to ignore. The men do not talk about it. One crawls underneath and finds where the cable can hold. Another checks whether the final drive has been shattered. A third listens for movement beyond the dark line of ground ahead. A flare rises. Everyone freezes. For a few seconds, the tank, the men, the cable, the mud, all of it becomes pale and exposed. No one moves. Even breathing feels too loud. The flare falls. Darkness returns. Hands move again. This kind of work rarely appears in dramatic accounts of armored warfare, yet it shaped the meaning of losses. A tank recovered from no man's land denied the enemy confirmation. It returned material to the Soviet system, preserved parts. Sometimes it preserved the vehicle itself. A German report might have listed that tank as destroyed because, at the moment of impact, that was what it appeared to be. But the night crew could change the outcome without ever changing the report. That is the strange cruelty of paperwork in war. Reality can change after the file has closed. Recovery was not always successful. Cables broke. Engines failed. German artillery woke up. Men died trying to save machines that would never move again. Sometimes a crew reached a tank and found the damage too severe. Sometimes they stripped what they could and left the hull behind. Sometimes the attempt itself became another loss. But even failure could produce value. Periscope removed. Track links taken. A machine gun salvaged. Tools recovered. A wounded crewman found. A map case pulled from inside. War wastes almost everything, but armies under pressure learn to waste less than their enemies expect. The Germans understood recovery too, of course. They had their own repair and salvage systems. German crews also retrieved damaged vehicles where possible, and German maintenance units performed remarkable work under terrible conditions. No serious account should pretend only one side knew the value of repair. The difference lay in scale, conditions, industrial backing, and expectation. As the war continued, Soviet forces developed a grim rhythm. Absorb losses, recover what could be recovered, repair what could be repaired, replace what could not, attack again. It was not elegant. It was not painless. But it kept pressure on the German front in ways kill reports did not always predict. The night crews were part of that rhythm. They were the hands reaching back into the battlefield after the official violence paused. They turned categories into questions. They made destroyed conditional. Sometimes, by dawn, the Germans looked out and saw the same field changed. The burned hull remained. The shattered one remained. But one disabled tank had moved. Another had been dragged behind Soviet lines. The track marks told the story. Deep grooves in mud. Scrapes through snow. A dark trail where a machine had been pulled away like an animal dragged from a trap. And yet, in the German count, it still existed as a kill. This was not a small contradiction. It was a crack in the relationship between battlefield success and operational understanding. Because if enough tanks moved through that crack, the numbers at headquarters would begin to lie without anyone needing to invent them. Behind those night crews stood something larger. A repair system, an industrial system, a state willing to tear itself apart and rebuild its armies from metal, labor, and necessity. The Germans were not only fighting tanks. They were fighting the machinery that made tank losses temporary. The factory behind the front. A damaged tank did not travel alone. If it survived the first hours after being hit, it entered a world behind the front that German observers rarely saw clearly. There were collection points, repair teams, mobile workshops, depots, railheads, factories, spare part channels, exhausted clerks, mechanics, drivers, welders, and officers deciding which machines would be saved and which would be stripped. This was the factory behind the front. It did not always look like a factory. Often it looked like confusion. Rows of damaged tanks waiting in mud. Engines suspended from makeshift beams. Turrets removed and placed beside hulls like severed heads. Men sleeping beside toolboxes because walking back to a shelter took too much time. Trucks arriving late. Parts missing. Orders changing. A vehicle marked for repair suddenly stripped because another unit needed components immediately. But beneath the disorder was a brutal logic. The Soviet Union had moved much of its industry eastward after the German invasion. Factories beyond the reach of the early German advance poured out tanks, guns, engines, and spare parts under conditions that were themselves severe. Workers labored through cold, hunger, overcrowding, and relentless quotas. The T-34 became not merely a tank, but a product of an entire wartime civilization reorganized around survival. New production mattered enormously, but repair mattered too. A repaired tank could return faster than a newly built one could travel from factory to front. A salvaged component could keep another machine moving when supply failed. A mobile workshop near the front could reduce the time between damage and return. When multiplied across hundreds and thousands of vehicles, these small recoveries altered the meaning of loss. The German reports often captured the violence at the front edge. They did not always capture the Soviet system behind it. That system was imperfect. Soviet tanks suffered mechanical failures. Crews sometimes lacked training. Communications could be poor. Maintenance was often rushed. The Red Army made costly mistakes and paid heavily for them. But the system had one advantage that became more important as the war dragged on. It accepted roughness. It did not require every returned vehicle to meet an ideal peacetime standard. It needed vehicles fit enough for the next task. A tank with a mismatched road wheel could fight. A tank with scarred armor could fight. A tank with a patched fuel line could move far enough. A tank without a radio could still follow signals, flags, shouted orders, or the movement of others. None of this made it easy. It made it possible. German engineering culture often prized quality, precision, and technical sophistication. German tanks could be formidable weapons, especially in skilled hands. But complex machines placed demands on maintenance, transport, parts, and time. On the Eastern Front, time was often the rarest material. A Soviet vehicle that could be roughly repaired and pushed back into service could have an operational effect greater than its technical condition suggested. This helps explain why German commanders could look at terrible Soviet losses and still face repeated Soviet attacks. The Red Army was losing tanks, sometimes at horrifying rates. But losses did not translate neatly into absence. New machines arrived. Damaged ones returned. Wrecks fed repair yards. Crews were replaced, often at terrible human cost. Units were rebuilt. The German army might win the visible exchange and still fail to stop the larger process. That was the nightmare behind the numbers. A report from the front could say that Soviet armor had been badly mauled. It might be true, but if the Soviet system could restore enough strength quickly enough, then the next attack would come before German expectations adjusted. The German commander would not face the same formation in the same condition. He would face a reassembled force, part new, part repaired, part improvised, all driven by operational necessity. There is a cold arithmetic in this. A tank destroyed beyond recovery is gone. A tank disabled for 2 days is absent briefly. A tank stripped for parts may live inside other vehicles. A tank repaired poorly but quickly may influence one more battle. A tank counted twice may inflate enemy losses without changing actual Soviet strength at all. The report sees categories. The repair system sees flow. And war is often decided by flow. Fuel flowing, shells flowing, replacements flowing, wounded flowing back, repaired machines flowing forward. German officers were not blind to Soviet production. Many understood, especially as the war continued, that the Soviet Union possessed enormous industrial depth and a frightening ability to replace losses. But understanding it abstractly was different from feeling it tactically, when a unit that believed it had shattered Soviet armor saw more tanks forming again opposite its line. That experience created a kind of disbelief. How many did we destroy yesterday? How many can they still have? Why are they attacking again? The answer was not one thing. It was factories. It was recovery. It was repair. It was simplified design. It was ruthless prioritization. It was human endurance. It was also the German failure to distinguish clearly between tanks stopped in combat and tanks permanently removed from the war. Behind every misleading report was a larger question. What counts as loss in a war where the enemy can turn wreckage back into pressure? The German command wanted numbers that would explain the battlefield. But the Soviet system kept producing realities that made those numbers feel outdated almost as soon as they were written. And when outdated numbers guide decisions, confidence becomes dangerous. The next part of the story is not about steel. It is about arithmetic, and how arithmetic can comfort an army right up to the moment the horizon fills again with tanks. The arithmetic of overconfidence. A number can calm a room. In a command post, after a day of fighting, men gather around maps and reports. Boots scrape the floor. A telephone rings. Someone writes with a pencil because ink has frozen or spilled or simply run out. The air smells of damp wool, tobacco, dust, and fatigue. Then the figures arrive. Enemy tanks destroyed. High. Enemy attack repulsed. Friendly line holding. A commander reads the report and feels, perhaps for the first time that day, a little space open in his chest. The enemy has paid heavily. Soviet armor has been cut down. Tomorrow may be easier. That is how arithmetic becomes emotional. It does not only inform decisions. It gives men permission to believe they have survived the worst of something. But if the number is unstable, the comfort is unstable too. Suppose a German unit reports 30 Soviet tanks destroyed in a series of engagements. Some are genuine permanent losses. Some are disabled but recoverable. Some are counted by more than one gun crew. Some are abandoned temporarily and later dragged away. Some are so badly damaged that they will never fight again, but still yield parts. Others are replaced by newly arrived machines before the German command fully understands the enemy's remaining strength. The report says 30. The battlefield effect may be 20 or 15, or something more complicated than any single number can carry. What matters is not only whether the report is wrong. What matters is what decisions are made from it. If a commander believes Soviet armored reserves are nearly exhausted, he may hold reserves back. He may expect a pause. He may assume the enemy needs time to regroup. He may underestimate the next attack's weight. He may misread the meaning of silence across the front. Silence on the Eastern Front did not always mean weakness. Sometimes it meant engines being repaired. Sometimes it meant new units moving into assembly areas. Sometimes it meant recovery crews working through darkness. Sometimes it meant the next blow was being built from machines the Germans believed already gone. The mathematics of survival is rarely dramatic in the usual sense. It does not always produce a single heroic moment. It works through small margins. A track repaired before dawn, a vehicle towed out of shellfire, a gun cleaned and remounted, a fuel pump taken from a wreck, a crew reassigned, a tank returned 3 days earlier than expected. One machine, 1 hour, one road. On a map, such things look minor. On a battlefield, they can change behavior. A single tank appearing at the wrong moment can force an anti-tank gun to fire early, revealing its position, can make infantry hesitate. It can lead a commander to believe a larger force is coming. It can carry men across open ground who would otherwise be pinned down. Can absorb fire meant for softer targets. It can block a narrow path long enough for other units to move. The German report might have removed that tank from the enemy order of battle. The battlefield had not. This is why the difference between tactical destruction and operational reduction mattered so much. German units could inflict real damage and still overestimate the lasting effect of that damage. They could win an engagement and misread the enemy's ability to return. They could produce accurate descriptions of immediate combat and inaccurate expectations about what would follow. That is a subtle kind of failure. It does not look like panic. It looks like confidence. The Eastern Front repeatedly punished that confidence. Soviet attacks often came after losses that seemed unbearable. Formations that had been mauled were rebuilt. Sectors believed weakened became active again. German troops who had watched Soviet armor burn found themselves facing fresh or repaired armor days later. To the man in the foxhole, this could feel almost unreal. He had seen them destroyed. He had heard the reports. He had watched the smoke. And now the engines were back. The sound of a T-34 engine was not elegant. It was rough, heavy, mechanical, sometimes uneven. But in the distance, through mist or snow or dawn haze, it carried a message no report could soften. They are coming again. For German morale, this mattered. Repeatedly seeing an enemy return after supposedly catastrophic losses could create a sense that destruction itself was not enough. The German soldier did not need a statistical lecture to understand the problem. He felt it in the body, the exhaustion, the disbelief. The question repeated quietly between men. How many more? The Soviet side paid for this persistence with lives and machines at a scale that should never be treated lightly. Many attacks failed. Many tanks did not return. Many repaired vehicles were fragile. Many crews went forward knowing their machine was not ideal. The Soviet system could be wasteful, harsh, and indifferent to individual suffering. But it produced pressure. And pressure is not measured only by elegance. German reports tended to measure what had been hit. Soviet operational reality was shaped by what could still be used. Between those two measurements lay a gap large enough to mislead armies. A commander reading inflated or misunderstood kill numbers might believe the enemy's capacity was declining in a straight line. War rarely declines in a straight line. It stutters. It recovers. It shifts. It hides strength behind loss and weakness behind apparent success. The Soviets could lose tanks and still increase pressure in a sector if replacements, repairs, and reserves arrived faster than German expectations allowed. That is why arithmetic became overconfidence. Not because numbers were useless, because numbers without context became seductive. They turned the battlefield into something cleaner than it was. They allowed commanders to believe that enough destroyed vehicles meant the enemy must soon behave logically, must pause, must weaken, must run out. But the Red Army was not behaving according to German comfort. It was behaving according to a different equation. Absorb, recover, repair, replace, attack. And when that equation reached the front line, it did not arrive as a statistic. It arrived as tracks grinding through mud, engines coughing through smoke, and silhouettes appearing where German reports said there should have been fewer. When the destroyed tanks came back, the first sound was usually not the gun. It was the engine, low at first, almost uncertain. A vibration carried through ground and air before the shape appeared. Men in forward positions learned to hear it differently from trucks, differently from artillery tractors, differently from their own vehicles. A tank engine had weight in the sound. It did not simply approach, press toward you. For a German infantryman who had survived the previous day's attack, that sound could feel impossible. The field ahead still held wrecks, blackened hulls, broken tracks, a turret sitting at a wrong angle. The evidence of yesterday's defense lay in plain sight. Reports had gone back. Soviet armor had been stopped. Losses had been counted. The men had slept, if sleep was possible, believing the worst of that particular assault had passed. Then, in the morning haze, Soviet tanks appeared again. Some were new to the sector. Some came from reserve formations. Some had been repaired. Some may have carried scars from earlier fighting. Bent fenders, patched armor, missing external fittings, wheels that did not match, smoke stains not fully cleaned from the hull. They did not look invincible. They looked used. That may have made them worse. Perfect machine can be admired. A scarred machine that keeps moving sends a different message. Says damage was not enough. German anti-tank crews had to make their decisions quickly. Fire early and reveal the gun. Wait and risk being overrun. Shift position and lose the best shot. Hold fire while Soviet infantry moved closer behind the armor. Every second carried weight. The return of Soviet tanks after heavy losses did not mean German reports were always false. Many Soviet vehicles really had been destroyed. Many crews had died. Many attacks were costly failures. But the repeated appearance of armor in sectors where German units believed they had inflicted decisive losses created a psychological and operational shock. The battlefield contradicted the paper. Imagine a German gun commander watching through field glasses as three T-34s move through smoke. He remembers the previous day. He remembers the claims. He remembers the burning vehicles. He may not know whether these are repaired tanks, replacement tanks, or machines from another unit. In that moment, the distinction hardly matters. The enemy still has armor. The next shell must be loaded. This is where the misunderstanding became physical. Not in headquarters, not in archives, not in post-war analysis, but in the muscles of men trying to move a gun trail through mud while Soviet tanks closed the distance. It became the dry mouth before the order to fire. It became the loader's hands slipping on the shell casing. It became the officer realizing that yesterday's success had not purchased the safety he expected. What they believed, enough kills would break the weight of the next attack. What really happened, enough Soviet tanks, repaired or replaced or simply not as permanently lost as claimed, kept coming back into the battle space. This does not make the Red Army unstoppable. It was stopped many times. It suffered defeats, failures, waste, and terrible losses. But the German expectation of Soviet exhaustion repeatedly failed to match the reality of Soviet regeneration. That word matters. Regeneration. Not resurrection in a mythical sense. Not dead machines rising by miracle. Real regeneration. Factory output, recovery crews, repair depots, cannibalized parts, crews reassigned, damaged formations rebuilt, reserves committed. Human systems turning loss into renewed pressure. To a soldier at the front, the system was invisible. He saw only the result. Another tank. Another attack. Another report that would have to be written. There is a scene repeated across the Eastern Front in many forms. German troops looking at Soviet losses and believing they had seen the limit, only to discover that the limit was farther away than expected. It happened with manpower. It happened with artillery. It happened with armor. The scale of Soviet endurance became one of the hardest truths for Germany to accept. And endurance does not always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it appears as a tank that should not be moving very well, moving anyway. A repaired T-34 with a rough weld across its side could still draw fire. A tank with a tired engine could still cross a field. A machine without full communication could still follow the one ahead of it. A tank that might break down later could still matter now. War is often decided by the now. The German report lived partly in the past. It recorded what had been seen, what had been hit, what had been claimed. The Soviet attack lived in the present with whatever machines could be made available. When those two realities met, the report did not stop the tank. The gun had to. This is the cruelest part of miscalculation. It is paid for by men who may not have made the error. The anti-tank crew at the front did not design the reporting system. The infantrymen in the trench did not compare loss records. The junior officer with a field telephone did not decide how headquarters interpreted yesterday's claims. Yet, when the next Soviet assault came stronger than expected, they were the ones who faced it first. Their fear was not ignorance. It was experience. They had learned that seeing a Soviet tank burn did not always mean seeing Soviet armor end. And behind that fear lay the human cost on both sides. The German crews forced to fight again, the Soviet crews sent forward in damaged or hastily repaired machines, and the mechanics who made movement possible without knowing who would survive inside the steel. The numbers had misled commanders. But the cost would be paid in bodies. The price paid in steel and flesh. A repaired tank still carried ghosts. No mechanic needed to say it. No crewman needed to ask. Sometimes the evidence remained inside the vehicle in ways no one could fully clean before the next order came. Burn marks along the interior. A dent where a shell had struck but failed to penetrate. A missing seat. A hatch that did not close properly. The smell of fuel, smoke, sweat, and something darker beneath it. A tank could return to service. The men who had first crewed it often did not. That is why Soviet resilience should not be confused with easy triumph. The ability to absorb losses was not painless. It was purchased with human beings. Tank crews fought in machines that were loud, cramped, hot when burning and bitterly cold when still. Visibility was poor. Communication could fail. A hit might kill instantly or leave men trapped in a hull filling with smoke. Ammunition could ignite. Fuel could burn. A hatch could jam. A driver could remain alive for seconds or minutes with no way out. The phrase tank loss is too clean for what it often meant. It meant a commander calling for a driver who no longer answered. It meant infantry passing a burning vehicle and looking away because they had to keep moving. It meant a mechanic opening a hatch and becoming silent. It meant a replacement crew being told the vehicle was ready enough. Ready enough. Those words carried the Eastern Front inside them. A repaired tank might not be safe. It might not be fully reliable. It might have alignment problems, engine trouble, damaged optics, weak welds, missing equipment, or a transmission that would not survive long. But the attack schedule did not wait for perfection. The front demanded steel. Commanders demanded movement. The enemy did not pause because a machine needed another day in the workshop. So men went forward in vehicles that mechanics had done their best to save. Sometimes the repair held. Sometimes it did not. There were German costs too. A German anti-tank crew facing repeated Soviet armor lived under a different kind of strain. The gun position could be well chosen, camouflaged, disciplined. The men could be experienced. But once the gun fired, concealment began to disappear. Soviet artillery might answer. Tank guns might search the position. Infantry might close in. The crew had to load, aim, fire, shift, and survive under the knowledge that one missed shot could be final. If yesterday's reports suggested Soviet armor had been badly reduced, but today's field filled again with tanks, the psychological blow was sharp. It was not only fear of death. It was the feeling that effort did not last. A gunner might watch a Soviet tank burn and believe he had removed one danger from the world. Days later, another tank came. Maybe not the same one. Maybe repaired. Maybe new. Maybe one assembled from parts of machines already counted as dead. To the man in the gun pit, the distinction did not soften the experience. The war kept returning. This is where documentary storytelling must be careful. It is tempting to turn Soviet repair crews into symbols of cleverness and German reports into symbols of arrogance. The truth is harder and more human. German soldiers were often reporting what they honestly believed under terrible conditions. Soviet mechanics were not magicians. Soviet commanders sometimes spent lives and machines ruthlessly. Both sides contained men trapped inside systems larger than themselves. The tragedy is that the systems kept grinding. A Soviet mechanic might repair a tank knowing another crew would take it forward into fire. He might never learn whether they survived. He might see the same machine return again, worse than before, or not return at all. He might strip parts from a vehicle whose crew he had known by name. He might be ordered to work faster, always faster, because the front had no patience for grief. A German staff officer might receive inflated reports without knowing which claims were uncertain. He might believe enemy armor was weakening because the numbers told him so. He might issue orders based on that belief. Somewhere ahead, men would discover whether the belief was true. War often separates decision from consequence. The report is written in one place. The cost arrives in another. For Soviet tank crews, the cost of regeneration was personal. A repaired army required replacement men. It required crews willing or forced to climb into machines that already bore signs of death. It required drivers to trust engines that had failed before. It required commanders to take vehicles into combat knowing their unit's strength existed partly because other crews had not come back. For German crews, the cost of misreading Soviet losses was repeated exposure. Underestimating the enemy's remaining armored capacity could leave positions underprepared, reserves misplaced, expectations wrong. A soldier who believed the Soviet attack had been broken might face a second blow before he had recovered from the first. There is no clean heroism in any of this. Only endurance, fear, duty, pressure, and steel. The Eastern Front consumed illusions because it consumed almost everything. It took the German belief in clean tactical accounting and buried it under mud, smoke, and repeated Soviet attacks. It took the Soviet belief that machines and men could always be replaced and answered with burned hulls and empty seats. Still, the war demanded more. More reports, more repairs, more attacks, more numbers that could never quite hold the human reality inside them. Eventually, some German officers began to understand that the problem was deeper than individual overclaims. It was not enough to count tanks hit. They had to understand whether Soviet armored power had truly been reduced. That realization came slowly, and for many men at the front, it came too late to matter. The delayed realization. Understanding in war often arrives after it is useful. At first, a commander sees the immediate facts. Soviet tanks attacked. German guns stopped many of them. The field contains wreckage. The report lists heavy enemy losses. The line holds. Then the pattern repeats. Another Soviet attack. More tanks than expected. More artillery behind them. More infantry moving through the gaps. More machines appearing after losses that should have weakened the enemy more deeply. At some point, the question changes. It is no longer only, how many did we destroy? It becomes, why are they still able to attack? That question haunted the German war in the East. The answer was larger than tank loss reporting. Germany faced a Soviet state that had survived the disaster of 1941, moved industry east, mobilized manpower, simplified production, improved command methods, and learned through immense suffering. Soviet armored operations evolved. The Red Army made mistakes, corrected some, repeated others, and continued fighting. No single explanation can carry the whole weight. But tank loss misreading formed one strand of that larger failure. German reports could describe battlefield success and still encourage operational misjudgment. They could show that Soviet armor had suffered badly, but not whether the Red Army's ability to continue armored operations had been truly broken. They could count visible destruction without fully measuring repair, recovery, replacement, and reserve commitment. Over time, German intelligence and commanders did recognize more of Soviet industrial and operational depth. They were not fools staring blindly at the front. Reports, interrogations, captured documents, battlefield experience. All of these contributed to a growing awareness that Soviet strength was more resilient than early assumptions allowed. But awareness did not solve the problem. Germany's own situation worsened. Fuel shortages, stretched logistics, attrition among experienced crews, Allied bombing, multiple fronts, and declining strategic initiative all narrowed German options. Even when commanders understood Soviet regeneration better, they could not always respond effectively. Knowledge does not create fuel. It does not replace lost veterans. It does not shorten a front that is too long. The delayed realization had a bitter quality. The German army had spent years trying to destroy Soviet forces in decisive quantities. It had achieved enormous tactical destruction. It had inflicted staggering losses. Yet the Soviet war machine did not collapse in the way German planning had hoped. The gap between what was destroyed and what was neutralized remained painfully wide. At the front, this realization did not arrive as theory. It arrived as exhaustion. A German officer looking at a map might see his division's sector thinning. Fewer reserves. Fewer operational vehicles. Ammunition lower than requested. Men tired beyond speech. Across the line, Soviet artillery registers targets. Tank engines begin moving at night. Reports say the enemy was badly hit last week, but reconnaissance suggests armor is assembling again. The officer might understand, finally, that the earlier numbers had not meant what he wanted them to mean. They had described damage. They had not promised relief. This difference sits at the center of the story. Damage is immediate. Reduction is sustained. Destruction is visible. Collapse is structural. German reports often measured the first and implied the second. The Eastern Front punished that implication again and again. For Soviet commanders, the lesson was also severe. Losses could be made temporary only within limits. A tank beyond repair was gone. A trained crew killed in action could not be replaced by metal. A repaired vehicle might fail. A rebuilt unit might lack experience. There was always a price. The Soviet system could absorb much, but absorption was not the same as immunity. Still, compared with German expectations, Soviet armored power remained more renewable than German reports often suggested. That renewability became part of the broader Soviet advantage as the war turned westward. By 1944, during operations that shattered German Army Group Center and pushed the front across Eastern Europe, Soviet armored and mechanized forces operated within a system far more capable than the one that had nearly broken in 1941. Repair, recovery, production, planning, and operational art had matured through blood. German reports could still count kills. But the strategic question had changed. Could Germany destroy Soviet armored power faster than the Soviet Union could restore, replace, and employ it? By then, the answer was increasingly no. That answer did not come from one battle or one report. It emerged from years of attrition, adaptation, industrial mobilization, and human loss. It emerged from thousands of small scenes. A cable hooked to a damaged hull, a welder working through the night, a gun crew claiming a kill through smoke, a staff officer adding numbers, a Soviet column forming again in the fog. History often remembers the large arrows on maps. But the truth hides inside the small verbs. Hit, stopped, recovered, repaired, returned, counted, misread. The German reports were not meaningless. They captured part of the war. But they could not fully capture the strange afterlife of Soviet armor on the Eastern Front. The way a tank could pass from weapon to wreck, from wreck to repair job, from repair job back to weapon, or from dead hull into the living body of another machine. That afterlife changed the meaning of loss. And loss, misunderstood long enough, changes the fate of armies. Now we return to the field where the story began, to the tank that should have remained dead, to the men in the mud, and to the report that never knew it had been outrun by reality. The difference between stopped and dead. By morning, the field looked different. Not peaceful. Never peaceful. The steppe still held the marks of the previous day. Shell craters, burned grass, torn track links, dark stains in the mud. Metal twisted into shapes no engineer intended. A German observer looking out from his position could still see Soviet wrecks. Some had burned down to black shells. Some sat open and silent. Some would never move again. But not all of them were where they had been. A set of drag marks cut through the mud toward the Soviet line. Wide, heavy, unmistakable. Somewhere in the night, men had come forward. Somewhere a cable had tightened. Somewhere an engine had coughed, failed, coughed again, or another vehicle had pulled until steel shifted against earth. The German report still held its number. The field had revised it. That is the quiet truth behind German misreadings of Soviet tank losses on the Eastern Front. The problem was not simply that German reports were false. Many were written by serious men under terrifying conditions, based on what they could see and what they had reason to believe. The problem was that the battlefield continued after the moment of observation. The meaning of a tank loss changed with darkness, control of ground, repair capacity, spare parts, replacement vehicles, and human endurance. They believed a stopped tank was often a destroyed tank. What really happened was that stopped was not always dead. A tank could be hit and removed from one attack yet still return later. It could be too damaged to fight yet valuable enough to save others. It could be counted by the enemy as a permanent loss while Soviet mechanics treated it as a temporary problem. It could disappear from the field before morning and reappear somewhere else, scarred but useful. The Eastern Front lived in that uncertainty. It was a war of massive operations, but also of small acts repeated thousands of times. A mechanic reaching for a wrench. A driver listening to a damaged engine. A recovery crew waiting for a flare to fall. A German gunner watching smoke and believing the target finished. A staff officer writing a number that looked firm because the war allowed no better one. None of these men controlled the whole story. Yet together they shaped it. German commanders wanted reports that translated combat into understanding. They needed to know whether Soviet armored power was being destroyed. But the numbers often captured only the first layer of truth. They showed tanks hit, tanks stopped, tanks burning, attacks repulsed. They did not always show what happened after dark. They did not always show which machines were recovered. They did not show which wrecks became parts. They did not show how quickly Soviet systems could turn damage back into pressure. That failure mattered because armies do not fight reports. They fight what appears on the ground. And again, what appeared on the ground was Soviet armor returning after losses that seemed, from the German side, too heavy to bear. There was no miracle in it. Only industry, coercion, discipline, improvisation, suffering, and repair. Only men working in cold mud with tired hands. Only factories running far from the front. Only commanders willing to spend machines and lives. Only a military system learning, painfully, how to keep moving through destruction. The cost was immense. Every repaired tank might carry the absence of its former crew. Every returned vehicle might ask another group of men to enter a machine already marked by fire. Every Soviet attack that proved German expectations wrong also added to the ledger of burned steel and dead soldiers. To call this resilience is accurate. To call it painless would be obscene. On the German side, the cost of misreading was paid by men who faced attacks they thought had been weakened more than they were. It was paid in gun pits, trenches, command posts, and retreating columns. It was paid by soldiers who discovered that tactical success did not always create operational safety. War is cruelest when it lets men believe they understand it. The German reports believed in the finality of visible destruction. The Eastern Front answered with movement. A tank that should have stayed in the field was dragged away. A part that should have rusted in a wreck was bolted into another hull. A formation that should have been exhausted formed again. A number that should have explained the battle became, instead, one more incomplete sentence. And somewhere, perhaps days later, a scarred T-34 moved forward again. Not clean, not invincible, not untouched by loss, but real. They believed Soviet tank losses could be read in the smoke of the battlefield. But what really happened was written later, in mud, in repair yards, in factories, and in the stubborn distance between a tank that had stopped and a tank that was truly dead. If you watched this story from beginning to end, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. And if someone in your family served in the war, on any front, in any uniform, you are welcome to share their name or memory below. Warfront Archive is dedicated to the stories that reports, maps, and official histories often leave behind. Subscribe to continue hearing them.